And now, please welcome Jim Embry.
Go down, oh, way down in Egypt land, tell Pharaoh to let my people go. Let my people go. This African-American spiritual embodies my presentation this morning. I think it also embodies this conference, its mission and purpose. And here are a few reasons why. This spiritual embodies the life of George Washington Carver, as he sought throughout his life to free himself and his people from the Pharaoh of racial oppression and violence, from lack of education, from hatred of any sort, and freedom from poverty and health disparities. Carver was continually transforming himself and those around him. Now, some of us consider Harriet Tubman as the Moses of our people. Some of us also say we could regard George Washington Carver also as the Moses of our people, who was called to serve in Egypt. We call it the South. But he also served the entire nation and world. This song is also relevant to the conference because each of us should be able to identify the pharaohs in our world. Maybe the pharaoh is this huge global footprint of monopoly agribusinesses that seek even greater control over our agricultural systems and food supply. Or maybe the pharaoh is this mechanical worldview, this Newtonian Cartesian view of the world that sees the earth as an inanimate object to be mined and devastated. See her as a resource for predatory behavior rather than Earth as the source of life. Or maybe the pharaoh is this systemic racism that impacts people of color. Then again, maybe the pharaoh is our society is this continual violence and oppression of women that is most acute in the food and agricultural sector. Many of us can remember our beloved Wangari Maathai, who led the Green Belt movement in Kenya, where she connected the oppression of women with deforestation. We recognize that the oppression of women, mothers, who we all come through, is connected to the devastation of our Mother Earth. So over this weekend, and in our continuing work, we will collectively better understand how our work is to let my people go. But this work must include not just human people. It must also include freeing the animal people, the plant people, the air people, the water people, and the rock people. Now, if you remind me during the Q&A part of the session, remind me to tell you the story about rock people from an indigenous standpoint. Now, since February is Black History Month, let's begin with something African. Sankofa is an African word from the Akan people in Ghana. This Sankofa bird, in my view, represents the essence of my presentation today. This idea of it's okay to reach back and grab some history, tradition, wisdom, and bring it forward as a way of providing light for the pathway ahead. It also means that you can't really know where you're going until you know where you come from. This Sankofa bird symbolizes this taking the best of this ancient knowledge and wisdom and carrying it forward as seeds. So my presentation today will be this back and forth of going back and grabbing some history to help us move forward. Now, looking back. So I live in Madison County, Kentucky, on a 30-acre family farm, which sits at the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, some of the oldest in the world. Our farm is also fed by the Kentucky River watershed, and it's nourished by the soil heavily mineralized with limestone rock. This is land that was inhabited for some 30,000 years by the Shawnee, Cherokee, and other indigenous peoples. Our family have been land stewards of this area since the early 1800s, when we were brought to Kentucky from Virginia in an enslaved condition. In this condition of enslavement, we worked this land. We cared for this land. Our grandmothers had babies in the fields in this land. And we learned to love the land. Now, my great-great-grandparents, who were formerly enslaved, 25 years after the Civil War ended, purchased this land from the Europeans who stole the land. So I come from 5 generations of what I call agrarian intellectual activist. And I will share more about this later in my talk. Now, this idea, this theme of rooted and rising. Again, I am blessed and honored to be here today to take part in this 43rd annual OEFFA Conference. This is my very first conference, and I hope to participate in years to come. Now, let me just share a few of my reflections on this theme of rooted and rising. The word rooted reminds me of our deep need to be rooted in our community. Much like George Washington Carver was for 47 years at Tuskegee. This idea of rootedness reminds me of humans who've been around the earth for about 2 million years. And the rootedness of plants with seeds, flowers, and fruit that have been around for 200 million years. I think about the rootedness of 500 plus indigenous nations that live in North America, oftentimes called Turtle Island, for the last 20 to 30,000 years. And I think about us, who've been here the last 500 years, however we came here. And we're still trying to figure out what it means to be rooted in this land. The word rooted also reminds me that we as humans, unlike trees, don't have our feet anchored in the soil, in the land. But our challenge in this conference ought to have as part of its purpose to help us reclaim this sacred rootedness, this sacred relationship with the land from which we're all made. Now again, George Washington Carver provides a model of how to be rooted. Each morning at Tuskegee, he would get up hour before sunrise, go into this garden, go into the forest, communicate with the plants, the trees, the stars, and would ask them to communicate with him. And they did. So we're all sensitive to this idea of indigenous people here in North America. Part of our responsibility is to honor those cultures of people, but also we each need to go back and understand our cultural lineage of indigenous peoples around the world and learn from our own cultural rootedness. And I maintain that we also ought to proclaim, shout out, say hallelujah, that we are all indigenous to the earth. Now, we also need to be rooted in our nation's founding. This image says, America is stolen land, built by people who were stolen from their land to do agriculture. So this nexus of land and labor for food and agriculture production is the foundation of injustice in our country that has permeated all other institutions. But here's the good news. Here at this juncture of food and agriculture, this juncture of dispossession and displacement, at this juncture, there is the possibility, the potentiality of transforming our food and agricultural systems, and by doing so, then transform all other institutions. And Carver understood this very well. Carver said, an injustice to the soil is an injustice to the farmer. Now, he meant specifically black farmers, black sharecroppers. And then in return, an injustice to the farmer is an injustice to the soil. Now, isn't that essence of quantum science? That we're all interconnected. We're all from the same source. Now, since we're here in Dayton, being rooted ought to mean lifting up the legacy of the great American poet, Paul Laurence Dunbar, who was born here in Dayton and whose mother and father were enslaved in Kentucky. Now, Paul was friends with the Wright brothers, and they did, as you know, their own way of rising. But Paul was also friends with the likes of Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, and George Washington Carver, to name a few. Booker T. Washington asked Paul Laurence Dunbar to write the song for Tuskegee Institute, which he did. And George Washington Carver visited Paul Laurence Dunbar and his mother several times in their home. Now, while you're in Dayton, if time allows, I encourage you to visit the Paul Laurence Dunbar house, or do a drive-by, take a picture, take a selfie. Because we talk about being rooted. Now, allow me just to read a short verse from one of Dunbar's poems called Sympathy. I know why the cage bird sings. Ah, me. It is not a carol of joy or glee, but a prayer that he sends from his heart's deep core, but a plea that upward to heaven he flings. I know why the cage bird sings. Now, this is a photo of Paul and his mother, Matilda. Again, Matilda was enslaved in Kentucky, in Shelbyville, before migrating north after the Civil War. Matilda grew up hearing poetry and yearning to write poetry. She taught her son Paul how to read and write, and also taught him how to write and love poetry. So Paul was rooted in his mother, as we all are. Now, this slide here, I did the end just this morning. The idea of being rooted. This here is an image of my dear friend Bing Davis. He's an incredible artist. He's a shop over on 3rd Street. And we hung out yesterday for quite a while. And I thought, well, no better person to share with you all about being rooted in Dayton, but also rooted in poetry and art. This movement of regenerative, organic, permaculture, biodynamic, agricultural movement needs to be essentially grounded in art. Now, Bing and I were talking yesterday and reminding ourselves of one of our other favorite poets. Her name is Toni Cade Bambara. And she has a quote that I oftentimes mention when I'm talking. And what Toni says is that the role of an artist is to make revolution irresistible. I'll say it again. The role of an artist, and it could be all of our roles, whatever we do in this work. The role of an artist is to make revolution, change, transformation, regeneration irresistible. And that was the essence of the life of George Washington Carver. Every day, he brought light in and light out to make change irresistible. Now, the reason why I read that poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar was because it inspired Maya Angelou to embrace it as the title of her book, I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. Where she described how we can overcome, we can rise up, that's the conference theme, we can rise up out of our individual and collective trauma and then manifest our divine light, our divine purpose, our divine work. So let's read this short verse from Maya. Read it together, like we're in church. Just like moons, I don't hear y'all out there, and like suns, with the certainty of tides, just like hopes springing high, still I'll rise. Now, and if I could get someone on the team facilitation, got about an hour and a half, about maybe about an hour in, just raise your hand, shout me down, whatever. Okay, thank you, very good. I've got a bunch of slides here and stories to tell, and I'm gonna have some time for just some conversation as well. Now, what I want to do is just take some time to describe how I got here today. About 2 years ago, I was the co-chair of the local planning committee for this conference, the North American Association for Environmental Education. And part of my interaction with this organization, as with Sierra Club and many other environmental groups, is to get them to understand that agriculture is part of the environmental movement. Agriculture has, per sector, probably the largest footprint on the environment. But because we're all impacted by this Newtonian Cartesian view of the world, we view things in separations, in silos. But anyway, at that conference, Eric Pulaski, who is the Sustainable Agriculture Educator, I believe, for OEFFA, approached me and asked me if I could come up to Ohio to be a part of this conference. I said, yeah, they do allow Kentuckians to cross the Ohio River. I would be honored. That's the short of how I got here. Now, but my connection with Eric goes back even further. July 2019, we were both in Denver for the Slow Food Nations gathering. And I have my Slow Food Nations cup here. And then in 2018, Eric and I found ourselves again in Portland at this association conference, Biodynamics Conference in Portland. Because, you know, Derek and I go to all the HIP conferences, okay? I don't know about the OEFFA staff. Don't get in trouble like Eric does, okay? But I just fall behind him. Now, as the screen shows, at this conference, I was invited to write a blog preceding the conference. And I chose this article that was kind of comparing and contrasting the life of George Washington Carver and Rudolf Steiner. It's called The Cup of Carver. There's the link. I have in my bag a few copies if you would like one. Now, when you go to the OEFFA website and you go to the websites of other organic farming organizations, and maybe look at who the pioneers were, oftentimes you see Steiner's name there, Robert Rodell, Eve Balfour, Howard, who found his theories out of the indigenous people in India. They're listed, not Carver, hardly at all. Now, you can read the articles that talk about, well, Steiner in 1923 wrote his agricultural course. 1923. But I pointed out in this article that Carver had already published 25 bulletins about what we now call organic agriculture by 1923. And I use on my farm various kinds of principles, including those that are biodynamic. I ain't hating on Steiner. I'm just trying to understand how folks can ignore the work of Carver that was so essential. Now, many of you all know that Steiner is also regarded as the founder of the Waldorf schools, which part of its approach is to have kids outside a lot in nature. And he founded the schools in 1919. I've been to a bunch of them. But in the article, I pointed out that Carver was a leader in the nature study movement from the 1890s. And one of his very first bulletins at Tuskegee in 1898 was about nature study and schools. Carver understood that to transform our agricultural system, we had to make sure that our children were rooted at an early age, rooted in land-based education. Carver understood that our children needed not this homocentric view of the world, but a more earth-centric view of the world. Now that year, they had me on double duty. I wrote a blog. I was also asked to write a lead article for their journal entitled Transforming the Heart of Agriculture. Now, I share these articles because they go into greater depth, provide all kinds of links, of course. And you can get these, again, online on my website. I have a few of them here as well. I encourage you to take time to look at these articles that share more of these thoughts about how we transform agriculture. Now, I mentioned that, and y'all can do it now while you're sitting on your phones. Put a link in, put a Google search. Organic agriculture, who are the pioneers? I bet you won't find Carver's name. So this situation reminds me of the book by Ralph Ellison called Invisible Man, where Carver is relegated within some sectors of this invisibility. So part of the role of OEFFA, Rooted and Rising, and all of our other kindred spirits ought to be to make Carver visible. Now, a few of my other involvements. This past April 2021, this book, We Are Each Other's Harvest, was published by Natalie Bazile, who is also the author of the book called Queen Sugar. It's her first novel that Oprah Winfrey and Ava DuVernay bought the rights to it and made it into this TV series. It all came from this book, Queen Sugar. Her first book, because of Oprah's help, went platinum. So HarperCollins gave her another contract to write a book about Southern Black farmers. But it got expanded into the experiences across the country of Black and brown farmers. It's a beautiful book. It's down here on my little altar. When I speak, thank you. I always try to bring these elements of the natural world that we talk about, but we don't think they ought to be present. So I bring those vibrations of Carver's peanuts and wood and feathers and rocks and things like that. Back to the book. Now, isn't this front cover image a beautiful image? Maybe you don't know, these are sisters Leah and Naima Penniman of Soul Fire Farm and the book Farming While Black. Now, a few of you all might remember during World War II, remember the image of Rosie the Riveter with her biceps looking like Michelle Obama's biceps? An icon of women being called into the workforce and the industrial plants, the shipyards, while the men were fighting in Europe. Well, thank you. I said, well, I know I talk fast. I have speeded the earth up, turning. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. Now, this is a beautiful book, folks. Beautiful photography. It's got poetry, first-hand articles, interviews, wonderful resources. But now, I maintain that this image of Leah and Naima ought to be our cultural icon. of this century, representing this return to the land by women and men. And we can do that in a variety of ways. Now, these sisters and I share a very deep, abiding love for George Washington Carver. Now, here's an added reason to buy the book and add it to your home library. Three years ago, 2019, I was invited by Natalie to contribute an article to this book because she'd heard me back again, she heard about me giving a talk in Portland about Carver and Steiner. And one of her friends, Melanie Edwards, who's up in Seattle, had heard me speak and went and blabbed on me, told on me. There's a crazy ass guy in Kentucky that his folk had connections with Carver back on their farm. So, this essay is entitled, you can read, Ancestral Vibrations Guide Our Connections to the Land. And what I do now, and I wear a variety of hats, I do a bunch of stuff. But I always try to lift up these connections, these ancestral connections that guide me every day. Now, this essay specifically allowed me to tell the story of our family in Madison County. Lift up my great-great-grandparents. We had three great-granddads that fought in the Civil War. One died in the Civil War. Now, if you look at the muster rolls of those men and women, again, some 200,000 black men and women fought in what's called the U.S. Colored Troops. And if you read their muster papers and their occupation, they were listed as farmers. So I regard this inclusion by Lincoln as encouragement of Douglas, this inclusion was called the U.S. Colored Troops as the legalized armed rebellion of black farmers. And these soldiers, some of them carried swords and guns and whatever. When they came back home, they turned those swords into plowshares. This is the picture of my great-grandparents who were children when the Civil War ended. And they're all pretty much located around where they've been enslaved for all kinds of reasons. Harriet Ballou became the area midwife and the herbal healer, herbal doctor, this area of Madison County. These are all brothers and sisters. Nanny was a seamstress, well known for her embroidery work, making all kinds of beautiful, fantastic clothing. And their brother, who is my direct line great-grandfather, Don Carlos, was a blacksmith, school teacher, but they were all small farmers as well. They were all able, again, as I mentioned earlier, they were able 20-some years post the Civil War to buy small parcels of land all near each other. Now, I'm going to do another family commercial break, talking about family parcels. Over here on my left, raise your hand, Brian, is my cousin, Brian Martin, lives here in Dayton. He's the executive director, I believe, for all the development that goes on in this county. My cousin, Brian Martin, see him afterwards. He will help you get through all the development channels. But his family owns in Western Kentucky 900 acres that were all members of the family assembling parcels of land together post the Civil War. On their property was a Rosenwald School. That's another whole presentation. The Rosenwald Schools, funded by Julius Rosenwald at the request of Booker T. Washington. George Washington Carver drew some of the sketches for the schools and also provided the landscape design for these schools. Across from my farm in Richmond, Kentucky, was one of these Rosenwald schools where my great-grandfather Don Carlos taught at. All of these great-grandparents, again, were small farmers, and they were part of what's called the Black Farmer Cooperative in Kentucky. It was also throughout the South. George Washington Carver, part of his work, and Du Bois, was to encourage these farm cooperatives. We realize now, if we're talking about transforming agriculture, cooperatives are a key, essential part of that transformation process. It has been historically, and it remains that way. My great-grandfather was also a school teacher, and he was part of the Black School Teacher Association. So this collaboration between Black farmers and Black school teachers had them organize every year what was called back then this Colored Chautauqua experience in Kentucky. I've been still researching this phenomenal experience. The local newspapers talk about how in 1919, at this Colored Chautauqua, 1,500 Black folk came to Richmond. Why? Because the speakers were the likes of Du Bois, Carver, Mary Church Terrell, and so forth. Folks came from Lexington, Cincinnati, probably even Dayton. Because again, remember, Carver was connected to Dayton through Paul Laurence Dunbar and the Black community here. Folk came probably from Louisville, maybe Detroit, because they came to hear these great speakers. Now, the reason why I mentioned this particular Chautauqua in 1919, so we're talking about this work of transformation. And I'm saying that Carver ought to be a student that we look at. We should be studying him to understand today, how do we transform our relationships with each other, organizations, individuals, elected officials? How do we do that? Carver provides light down the road. Now, many of you all probably don't know another connection with 1919. But can you imagine in the small town, Richmond, Kentucky, 1,500 Black folk assembling to learn about agriculture, cooperatives, working together, benevolent societies. And they had a reading list before they came. It's all in the newspaper. They were encouraged to read the works of Paul Laurence Dunbar, Langston Hughes, Phillis Wheatley, books by Ida B. Wells, Du Bois, Booker T. Washington. They had a reading list. Now, I came to this conference. I go to many conferences, but there usually ain't no reading list to prepare us for our conversations, prepare us for some type of common ground. Want to look back, St. Bird says. Now here's the importance of 1919. 1919, so named by James Warden Johnson, Red Summer. That was the summer when almost 40 cities around the country, white supremacists were on the attack, burning down communities, shooting people, hanging people, Black folk. Matter of fact, in Elaine, Arkansas, it says that some 200 Black people and 5 white people were killed. It was called the Elaine Massacre. This is the book that kind of lays out in more detail Red Summer. Here's how it looks on a map. But I mentioned earlier, the same year of Red Summer, Carver, Du Bois, my beloved great-grandparents, and those who were assembled were able to carry out this weekend experience without violence. Now, they were helped, of course, by about 20 local white citizens who probably served as a buffer, as a protection, telling the other folks, and look here, my county in Richmond, another presentation about that, was back in the Civil War, still is. I call Confederate stronghold. But the point is that Carver, as I mentioned, his whole life was about transforming what was around him. So in our work, when there is antagonism, maybe there's violence, maybe there's upheavals, how can we learn from Carver how to transform that antagonistic, potentially violent situation? Now, I'm going to run through kind of quickly a few other slides to describe some of my work. couple of weeks ago, I gave a similar kind of a keynote to the Organic Seed Growers Conference. It was virtual. I'm also a member in Kentucky of our Organic Association as well. They were talking about their conference back in January. Now, the Organic Seed Conference, Growers Conference, that conference had about 1,200 people from 30 different countries. As we know, this is a global movement. This was about seeds. In my talk, I pointed out in my talk, the carpet was all about seeds. Organic seeds, heirloom seeds. And the Jessup wagon that he and Booker T. Washington fashioned and got monies for, he always carried a variety of seeds to give the farmers, along with the bulletins, potential tools, plants, know-how. So I was advising them, as you are working on this sense of organic seeds, let's don't forget what's come before us. We can't just write up a manifesto about racial justice, equity. It's got to be more intentional. Now again, in my family, we have a long history of working in cooperatives in a variety of ways. I heard these stories growing up from my mother, my aunts and uncles. So in 1972, back when I was a bit younger, my wife, kids, and I were founders of what's called Good Foods Market and Cafe. This is inside the store. It's like Natural Foods Cooperative. About 10,000 owner members, do about $15 million a year in business. We were founded upon three principles: local food, organic food, and healthy food. They aren't always the same. The image here, the big brother, big black guy there, it's a good friend of mine named Rob. He's the current general manager, because we had to internally have some come to Jesus moments about what it means to be for diversity, equity, racial justice. It ought to mean seeing faces in the store in certain positions. That was 50 years ago. This year, we're celebrating our 50-year anniversary. Last year, I was part of this effort to organize the Ujamaa Seed Cooperative. And we have a particular interest in what we call culturally meaningful seeds, especially those of the African diaspora. This is some of the board members here. If you all don't know, the wonderful Ira Wallace of the Southern Exposure Seed Exchange, that's her holding the frame with the glasses on next to me, Ira Wallace. Also, back in 2008, became a member of Slow Food USA and Slow Food International, and we do a whole host of things. Various kind of programs, the Ark of Taste, which is a cataloging of seeds and other kinds of foodstuffs, like the churro sheep that the Dene people, we call them Navajo, have been shepherding for some 500 years, preserving those kinds of cultural foodways. As a part of this transformation, this reaching back, make sure that we're preserving these traditional varieties, because there's an onslaught, as we know, we all know that, there's an onslaught to reduce the diversity of what we eat what we grow. So our work in transforming ought to be to this work at local, regional, national, international levels of diversifying and reaching back and reclaiming these varieties. Terra Madre is one of our events held every 2 years. The last one in person was 2018. I invite you all to come to Torino, Italy in September. The 2022 in-person Terra Madre meeting Mother Earth. A kind of a title borrowed from the Pachamama Alliance. We have as well an indigenous Terra Madre network. We have a Turtle Island delegation of indigenous folks from North America who come under their own banner of Turtle Island. This idea of transformation, food sovereignty. Speaking of that, part of our work needs to be to reach back and understand who are the people that live here in the Ohio region, or wherever you live. How do we understand their culture? How do we lift it up? What were those traditional agricultural foodways? It's another whole presentation. Now, I'm reaching a point of Q&A, but I want to mention, in 2018, I was in Toronto representing Slow Food USA at this Parliament of World Religions. It included 10,000 people at the Toronto Convention Center, like we have here, from about 200 countries, and every faith on the planet was there. Now, here's why I mentioned it. You see the water here. The conference began with First Nations women going to the river to do a water ceremony. And they did that ritual and brought the water back up outside the convention center, where the men were about to start the sacred fire. The sacred fire burned 24/7 for a whole week. It was a place for spiritual rejuvenation, drumming, singing, dancing. When I was working with Will Allen on Growing Power and the Growing Food Injustice gatherings, we also scheduled our gathering based upon the full moon weekend. You said, well, Jim, like, we heard you was crazy. Now you showing you crazy. Why would you schedule a conference around a full moon? And why would you have women out getting wet and folk around the fire? We're talking about transformation. On the full moon, the women go out on their own and do a grandmother moon ceremony. Because we understand how the moon impacts women's menstrual cycle, not just ocean tides. So I'm encouraging OEFFA, as I've done other conferences, to kind of rethink how we present our conferences. At this conference as well, they had one of the convention rooms was like fabricated with willow branches to create a longhouse. This circular experience where again, the First Nations people had programming there from about 7 a.m., began with morning prayers and dancing until the evening. They had cedar, they had willow. Wow. They did the fire and this lodge and a convention center? Yes, they did. Now, I mentioned that to say that next year, in 2023, the public will be in Chicago. Now, in 2018, I was on a panel with a variety of people talking about food justice, economic issues. I did a workshop on food sovereignty through the lens of George Washington Carver and indigenous people. At the conference, I had the blessing to meet a guy named Gandhi, who was a grandson of Mahatma Gandhi. And I talked about the connection between Gandhi and Carver. Now, what I'm going to do take up time. I want to allow room for some. Have you ever wondered how Dr. King adopted his nonviolent philosophy from Gandhi? Talk about being rooted. Well, it actually goes back to Carver. And we're talking about this idea of transformation through the lens of Carver. Back in the 20s, Gandhi, as you know, had left South Africa, had moved back home to India, and was trying to lead this movement, this revolution, this transformation of Indian hierarchy controlled by the British government of Indian peasants. And he was fasting. And Gandhi had heard about this black guy in the United States who was also working with peasant sharecroppers. He was also working to create all these products out of peanuts, 300 some odd products, working with cowpeas, sweet potatoes, soybeans. And Gandhi wanted to better understand how he could utilize these powerful, energy-rich seeds for his people, and also as part of his coming off of a fast and utilizing various kinds of like peanut milks and soy milks and things of that nature. Of course, as we realize, going to the stores now, with all these non-dairy products, Carver wrote bulletins on those for years. When you go into that section and get that non-dairy, whatever it might be, think about, wow. That's what Carver was talking about way back in the 1900s. But, so Gandhi sent an emissary to the United States to talk to Carver specifically about his work, his products, his philosophy, because again, Carver was already living this nonviolent philosophy. So in the 1930s, was a guy named Howard Thurman, his wife, who were doing a tour of Asia. He was friends with Carver. And Carver said, well, hey, you know, Howard, when you and your wife go over, you ought to stop by India and say hi to my friend Gandhi. And they did. Thurman came back. He was good friends with a guy named Benjamin Mays, who also went to India at the request of Gandhi. Carver, look here. Here's a letter from our dear friend Gandhi to Benjamin Mays. Now, Benjamin Mays and Howard Thurman were also good friends with Dr. King's father. And advised his father and advised King. They knew King as well, Dr. King. The King, man, you ought to, we've been to India, we've met with Gandhi, he's the real deal. I'm just saying that Carver's life every day was about transforming himself and transforming those around him, and also embracing being transformed by environments around him. How's my time? Okay. So thank you all for listening. Feel free to contact me by email, by phone. Come to the farm. See me the rest of the weekend. So again, I encourage us all, if we're talking about transforming agriculture, and Carver did this in the South. He was about enhancing black soil that was impoverished, and also enhancing the livelihood of black souls in the South. His work, his life, and legacy, in my view, are essential to whatever we're doing in our local communities, in our organizations, in our faith institutions. His work, in my view, is essential. Of course, not only his, of course not. So, thank you. I'm open now for questions, thoughts, reflections.